A few months ago, probably just before Christmas, I overheard a conversation on the train from Manchester to London between two Scouse lads that really stuck with me. Now, these two teenage lads from Liverpool were talking about life, school, girls, the usual rubbish that teenagers talk about. But at one point, one of them said to the other something along the lines of, "I've heard Andrew Tate talking about that, and he's so right." There was no sarcasm, there was no joking, and it wasn't being said in an ironic manner. He was completely serious. Now, that moment caught my attention kind of for two reasons. The first was just the confidence in the statement, because it sounded, he was so certain he had found the rule book that explained life. You know, the meaning of life was unlocked by Andrew Tate. But the second thing only really came to me later on. But I was struck how confident he was about the opinions of someone he'd never met when it came to all of these important life issues. Like, did he not have anyone real in his life to do that? Because whether people like it or not, millions of young men are now turning to online figures to answer a question that every generation of boys eventually ask themselves. And what does it actually mean to be a man? And right now, a lot of those answers are coming from the internet. So this is The Men We Are, a podcast for men who are trying to understand themselves a little better, the ones who sometimes feel like expectations around masculinity are a bit confusing, the ones who were raised hearing a lot of things men shouldn't be, but not always what they should be. So each episode we explore the ideas, pressures, identity shaping modern masculinity. And it's not preachy, it's not judgmental, it's just to understand what's really going on beneath the surface. And today we're looking at something that social media has made impossible to ignore. And it is the rise of these online masculinity influencers. You know, names like Andrew Tate, names like Jordan Peterson, who for some people are incredibly dangerous, but for others, they are absolute lifesavers. And for a huge number of young men, they're simply the first people who seem to speak directly to them. And that alone is worth paying attention to, because movements don't grow unless they're filling a gap. Like, they don't grow in a vacuum. Nazism didn't rise in a confident Germany. It rose in a humiliated one. Successful businesses rarely invent needs. They spot the need, they see the gap, and they build something that is going to fill it. So if millions of young men are turning into a particular message online, maybe the more interesting question isn't why are they listening to, but rather what gap is being filled. So in this episode, I don't want to caricature anyone. I'm not going to try and hang someone out to dry. I just want to understand two things. And that's, what message are these influencers actually putting out that has millions of young men listening? And because of the manner in which this podcast works, what effect is that message having on the boys who are slowly becoming men under the influence of that message? So before we dive into who and what these influencers actually are, I think it's really important to say that over the last 20 years, there has been enormous and really, really important progress in the conversations around women's rights and gender equality. And to question the importance of it means maybe you need your head screwing on a bit tighter. But alongside that progress, many boys grew up hearing far more about what masculinity shouldn't be than what it should be. So psychologist Roy Baumeister, he's written about the human need for meaning and significance. And young men in particular are highly responsive to status hierarchies and stories surrounding competence. And if you add into that, with some context, in the UK and the US, women now outnumber men in university enrollment. And boys get disciplined more frequently in school. I mean, think back to school, think about the way a teacher would shout at a boy, and think about the exact same result when they're disciplining a girl. Very, very different animal. So when our identity feels uncertain, an offering of clarity actually becomes quite attractive. And whatever else you say about figures like Tate or Peterson or others, they do offer clarity, or at least a form of clarity to the people that are hearing it that makes sense. So Peterson's message often centers around order, responsibility, hierarchy. He wrote a book, 12 Rules for Life, and it didn't become a bestseller by accident. It became a bestseller because it offered structure. And boys bloody love structure. We love it. We almost crave it. I mean, think about every war film you've ever seen, and the absolute fuck up in the opening scene turns into the best soldier in the troop because that military structure gave him direction, and it was unambiguous and it was clear. Tate, on the other hand, he is more about status, dominance, wealth, and he's really unapologetic about his version of masculinity in a culture many men kind of perceive being masculine as quite hostile. So in either case, the clarity is very, very powerful, especially when you're 16, 17, unsure who you're supposed to become, you know, really on the cusp of boyhood and manhood, your formative years. So I have to be honest that I didn't realize just how well followed these people were. Certainly I found out more by researching for this episode, but also when one of them popped up for having legal charges leveled against him. And obviously at that point they quote in the media just how many followers they have. Now, of course, I had seen clips of both of them from social media, but more often it was Peterson having heated debates with feminists as per his kind of demeanor and personality, and Tate showing off living the high life, you know, always a cigar in the mouth and, you know, the flash watch, all of those things. But I'd never really seen the message that they were putting out into the world, that so many young men were living by, almost like a mantra. But the two people that we're kind of looking at today, they are different, so we can separate them. Now, Jordan Peterson, first up, is a clinical psychologist, and he is a former professor. And his arguments, they often revolve around competence hierarchies, which at the most basic level is who is most capable of bringing value in whatever environment they're in. So he frequently points out that in countries like Norway and Sweden, occupational differences between men and women still remain strong. And these societies rank amongst the most gender equal. So this is sometimes called the gender equality paradox, which suggests that as societies become more economically equal, men and women may actually end up in gender typical career choices, not fewer. So what that means is in highly egalitarian countries, men will still dominate the physically dangerous and infrastructure heavy jobs. Women will be overrepresented in care orientated professions such as nursing, for instance. So Peterson uses this to argue that not all gender disparities are purely due to discrimination, and some may just be a reflection of the person's preferences. So basically, he always says this, that men like things and do jobs that involve things, you know, machines, building sites, flying airplanes, and women like people, hence being more represented in teaching, in healthcare. But there is a really important nuance that these aggregate differences, they still don't justify like individual stereotyping. But if we dismiss biological influence entirely, the argument's not accurate either. And this, it tends to be where the conversation collapses into shouting, because if you allow biology to enter the discussion, people start to fear like regression. And it's on that mindset that the best defense becomes offense. And it's a very, very loud, shouty offense. But understanding the difference isn't the same as like enforcing a limitation. So when young men hear Peterson saying, "You're not broken, there are hierarchies that exist, you can aim upwards," that message, especially to someone who's drifting a little bit, can feel really stabilizing. And it's back to our lad in the military at the start of a film who is a little bit rudderless, and he's being given a clear message and it's unambiguous in its direction. And whether you agree with it or not is totally different. So Andrew Tate, on the other hand, from Peterson, he represents something different. And where Peterson is very structured and academic, Tate is visceral, and he is very, very provocative because his message centers around financial dominance, physical strength, sexual abundance, and the one for me that feels very regressive is emotional detachment. He has the classic mindset that men are the strong, silent type. But there is an uncomfortable truth that for some young men who feel invisible or maybe a bit powerless, that his message does feel empowering. And sociologist Michael Kimmel, he's written about what he called aggrieved entitlement. And this is like the anger that wells up when individuals feel that they were promised a status, but they don't actually get to experience it. So when a man starts to feel that he's like economically stuck, he's been socially rejected, or he's sexually unsuccessful, he will buy into the idea that a narrative says, like, it was the system that lied to you. You can reclaim your dominance. And that will feel really intoxicating. Being aggrieved and then being told a clear way that, yeah, you can still have those things. But the thing is, with hyperdominance models, they come with a risk. A lot of it is at odds with what we've explored so far in season 1 of The Men We Are. Because hyperdominance models, they often equate vulnerability to weakness. And they may actually reduce relationships to transactions, which really is the polar opposite of the direction I want my life to go. And if you're listening to this, it's the opposite of the direction you want to go. So if masculinity therefore becomes performative off of the back of this message, it's not really integrated into who we are. And therefore our identity becomes a bit more brittle. So I have to be honest, the message from Tate was never my cup of tea. It's the matter-of-fact delivery that always seemed to turn me off. So as a result, I don't actually get to the point where I get the message he's putting across, because the method of delivery of the message put me off quickly enough that it didn't agree with my reception system. But I have heard people talk passionately about how right he is and how clarifying the message is, almost like they're a disciple spreading the gospel according to Andrew. And that's the scary thing, because when we look at prominent and perhaps polarizing leaders from history, actually from right now, with hindsight, we've seen that a lot of the messages weren't quite right or accurate, but the delivery was so powerful, and it made people feel seen and part of something. And because of that, opinion became fact. And that's very, very scary. But beyond the message itself, in the purest sense, technology adds another layer, and that's the algorithm. Because, social media platforms, they reward outrage and certainty. So if someone's offering opinions that are very nuanced in terms of, say, masculinity, that's never going viral. But if it's strong claims and polarizing clips, the algorithm will say, yeah, this is great. This is going to get clicked. The more controversial, the more engagement. And this creates what sociologists call moral amplification. And it's like extreme positions, they start to appear more common than what they actually are. So you have young men scrolling TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, whatever. They're not consuming a balanced 2-hour lecture about a subject. They're consuming 30-second intense, outrageous clips of dominance, certainty, confidence. And every time they watch one and the algorithm shows them the next one, as long as they let it play, the algorithm says they like this, I'm going to line up the next one and the next one and the next one. Because they like this, I'm going to keep showing it to them. So this confidence, even when it's misplaced, is very attractive, especially to someone who feels uncertain. So what's the real impacts? I mean, let's be fair. Many men report that Peterson specifically helped them to take responsibility of their lives, clean themselves up basically, and start pursuing a bit of meaning. And that, to me, that's great. That's all good stuff. And there's psychological backing for that. Like Viktor Frankl, he's a psychologist and a Holocaust survivor. He wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, that purpose is central to psychological resilience. So messages of responsibility and aim, they align with well-established psychological principles. But with the Tate style hypermasculinity, the risk increases if our empathy declines or women start to be viewed as status metrics, like women become trophies. And the real issue is that our emotional growth is stunted. And research consistently shows that rigid adherence to these traditional masculinity norms, particularly the emotional suppression and dominance, they correlate with poorer mental health. And we've seen that time and time again in this podcast alone. And the American Psychological Association, they published guidelines, like actual guidelines, noting that if you adopt extreme forms of traditional masculinity, it's going to be linked with aggression and relational difficulty. So basically, if you try to say, I'm a man, I'm masculine, grr, you're going to be aggressive and you're going to have really shitty relationships. But here's the balance, because it's not without responsibility. If mainstream culture fails to offer young men direction or purpose, what I think is more important is a positive masculine archetype, because in all honesty, I find that message really, really confusing. Those people, those young men, they will find it somewhere else. And there should be no surprise when they do. So the rise of these online masculinity influences, it's not random. It's symptomatic of what's happening in society, and it should tell us something, that young men are hungry, and it's not for money or sex. They're hungry for meaning. They want structure. They really want to know what their identity is that they can wear with pride without having it called into question. And some influencers, they do provide useful tools, but some also provide really combustible ones. So the real question actually isn't whether these figures exist and they're doing what they're doing. It's whether society, we the people, can we offer something better? I mean, we need to offer a version of masculinity that includes strength without cruelty, ambition without contempt, leadership without needing to be dominant, and the big one for me, as I keep banging the drum, emotional depth without being ashamed of that. Because if we don't define healthy masculinity clearly, someone else who has the confidence and the drive and certainty of what they believe, they will define masculinity loudly, and it will be their version of masculinity. And volume often wins over nuance, but hopefully not forever. So the men we are becoming will depend on which voices we choose to amplify and which parts of those voices we choose to integrate. So thanks again for joining another bonus episode from The Men We Are. Again, if this is hitting and you think someone else will get some benefit from it, I'd be really appreciative if you could like, rate, recommend, forward on to people. Let's get this in front of people that need to hear it. But outside of that, I wish you a nice couple of days. Hopefully the thought-provoking stuff gets the brain thinking. And as ever, I wish you the best of luck.